As far as the culture of blame, not benefits, is concerned, I want to ask the question, is that the government's get-out-of-jail card, or are we genuinely looking at a situation in this country of class warfare? And it's not just here, and as Christos pointed out, it's not a new thing. That quote comes from Malcolm X, black politician, black civic leader, or civil leader rather, way back in the 60s and 70s. And I think that quote is as true today about our press and our media as it was then when the assault of the American media was in the civil rights movement. And if you're not careful about the newspapers, they will have you hating the people who are being oppressed. And if you want some evidence of how bad that is, there's the description that you can find on the Little Britain website for Vicky Pollard, the so-called chav character. And isn't it wonderful that two privately educated, ultra-middle-class males can find the generosity and time in their lives to rip the absolute piss out of somebody who doesn't enjoy a single advantage that they've enjoyed in their lives? And isn't it wonderful that they can actually publicly say about a character in the drama that she's your common or garden teenage delinquent? We all know what that means. And the line that follows it about whether nicking stuff from a supermarket or swapping her baby for a Westlife CD, Vicky reacts to any accusation with indignant outrage, while filling you in on this thing what you know nothing about. What have we come to when people who would otherwise be classed as members of the working class in this country can be insulted and demonised like that? And if you want to get worse examples of it, go in the world of rock and pop and hit the Kaiser Chiefs. And there's the lyrics for one of their tracks. I tried to get to my taxi, a man in a tracksuit attacked me. Of course he was in a tracksuit. That's what they wear, isn't it? Up north, in the working class communities in the council estates. Nobody's got a crease in their trousers. Everybody's got their joggies on. And he said it before, he said he saw it before me, wanted to get things a bit gory. Girls scrabble round with no clothes on, interesting part of the town they're hanging out in, to borrow £1 for a condom. If it wasn't for chip fat, they'd be frozen. And how many people are buying Kaiser Chiefs records, and how many people are watching Little Britain, and how many people are making themselves complicit in this kind of class hatred. And if you want a worse example, this genuinely, absolutely genuinely, cross my heart, right hand up to God, comes from an advert for Gym Box, which is a major gym chain, and they offer classes in chav fighting. And that's what they say. That's public, right? If you said that and replaced the words in that every time it says chavs with black or gay, you would be committing a crime. You would be liable to be charged. If you wanted to stand back and say these things about almost any other group, apart from the working class, you would be liable to legal action. But hey, it's just a bit of fun, isn't it? And we can all go into W.H. Smith's and buy the little book of chavs. We can all go onto the Chavtown website and we can all see how we're classed. We can all see how a certain category of people within our society are stereotyped and labelled. And this is what happens. And isn't it interesting? If you're familiar with the Shannon Matthews case, what happened with Shannon Matthews was she was a girl, young girl who was kidnapped by her own mother. Her mother then claimed she'd gone missing in order to eventually be able to claim the reward. It was something like £50,000. And her partner, a guy called Meehan, was complicit. He was also an accomplice. He was also involved. They basically had Shannon, their daughter, tied up in the attic and drugged to keep her quiet so that they could pretend that she was missing. And this case, which I think to any right-thinking person, any reasonable person, is absolutely exceptional, astonishing. that somebody would kidnap their own daughter and hold them hostage for a reward, that somebody would think that this was even a sensible way of making money. But here's what David Cameron, the Prime Minister, said about it. That the verdict last week in Karen Matthews, the mother involved, and her vile accomplice, is also a verdict on our broken society. If only this was a one-off story. Because let's face it, folk are kidnapping their kids every day of the week. You know, you can barely go around Whitfield for the number of kids that are trapped in their attics. Actually, there's a challenge for you. Go into Whitfield and find an attic. Right? Find me a house with an attic. But for sure, see these working class people in the north, Scotland, North England, their attics are full of kidnapped children, drugged and tied up, hoping somebody will give them an offer for them. It just happens all the time, doesn't it? Oh, and as a result of this, as a result of all these people kidnapping their own children, let's cut benefits. Let's end the something-for-nothing culture. And if people don't take a reasonable offer of a job, because, guys, there are thousands of them out there, aren't there? I mean, there are so many jobs, you're forever getting employers wheeling people into their businesses and saying, would you please come and work for me, regardless of what qualifications you've got, you'll be fine. Does that happen? Is that a reality? And then David Cameron's wonderful comment at the end, no ifs, no buts, no maybes. There's a man who comes from 3 generations of stockbrokers. 3 generations of stockbrokers. David Cameron's family were apparently brokering stocks before the stock market opened. Right? A man who has known nothing but wealth and privilege, taking the opportunity to demonize an entire class and category of people on the basis of what anybody would recognize as being an utterly exceptional case. And without in any way distracting or taking away from the enormous sympathy that I have for the McCann family and what they've gone through, did anybody in public life like David Cameron come out and say that what happened with the McCanns was symptomatic of a broken Britain, where middle-class people go on holiday to resorts where they can get someone else to look after their kids and leave them so that they can go and get hammered and have some tapas and check on them every half hour to make sure they're okay. Did anybody say that? How much money has been spent on the Madeleine McCann case? It's millions. Millions. And from a parent's point of view, absolutely. And let me tell you, I've done it. I've done it as a parent. I've left my kids where I thought they were safe in a hotel room. I've gone off to have something to eat, and I've gone back to check on them, just like the McCanns did. I was lucky they weren't. I'm not condemning them, and I'm not condemning their behaviour. What I am condemning is the fact that it's open season on people like Karen Matthews, and it's not on those who enjoy the safety and security of middle-class status. And why does it happen? Why does it happen? It happens partly because of attitude. Again, another quote from David Cameron. We talk about people being at risk of poverty or social exclusion. It's as if these things, obesity, alcohol abuse, drug addiction, are purely external events like plague or bad weather. Of course, circumstances, where you were born, your neighbourhood, your school, and the choices your parents make, have a huge impact. Now, he says huge impact, but doesn't it come across like a concession? Doesn't it come across like a concession? And isn't the real point he's making is that people choose to be obese? You know, do you believe that? Do you believe that people go, I know what I'll do? I'll get fat. You know, do you think anybody actually goes around and says, do you know what I'd really like to be? I'd really like to be gross. Pass me more pies. I mean, sorry, do you know, I got up this morning and I thought I was pretty fat, and then I saw somebody fatter. I'm certainly going to up my game. Get the pies in. I mean, surely. Right? On drug addiction, that's a lifestyle choice, isn't it? You know? I'm going to start taking crack because it's going to get me right hooked, and it's going to turn my life into a complete wasteland where I'm no longer in control of the choices I make, and I'll probably end up on the game. That'll be fine. Is that a lifestyle choice people make? Or is it a lifestyle that people stumble into for all sorts of reasons? Many of them about their views of themselves and their status and the level of their self-esteem. One of the things that I'm fond of talking about is the London riots. And if you can cast your mind back to them, they were before the Olympics. You know, last summer, glorious summer, Olympic summer, triumph for Team GB. We won everything, didn't we? We sailed, we punted, we rode, we cycled, we did all of that stuff. We were real heroes. And we were even good at the Paralympic stuff. And suddenly, people with disability enjoyed a completely different status in Britain from they'd been enjoying up until then, hadn't they? You know, where they were having to prove how disabled they were in order to preserve their benefits. I'm surprised they didn't cut David Weir's benefit the moment he crossed the finishing line at the marathon. I'm surprised David Cameron wasn't standing there going, you can't be that disabled, you've just won a gold medal. Let's cut your benefits. We need to think through seriously what's going on here. But if you can get back beyond that to the London riots, isn't it interesting? Nobody was looting Marks and Spencer's. Nobody was coming out of Marks and Spencer's with armfuls of Blue Harbour labelled goods, saying, look at these wonderful elasticated waist chinos that I've been able to purloin from Marks and Spencer's. Nobody was coming out going, I've got a cracking row of autographed suits here. Nobody was looting Primark. In fact, some of the looters were putting stuff into Primark to try and help them out and raise their game. Nobody was looting Clark's shoe shops apart from a group of Jamaicans because desert boots, Clark desert boots, are big out in the West Indies. Apart from that, nobody was getting in for their endlessly comfortable shoes that you can wear for hours on end and have your feet still feel and smell as fresh as they did at dawn time. Nobody was doing that. What everybody was doing was headed for Superdry. And if they looted a shoe store, nobody took the high-techs. Very few people took the Reeboks, everybody took the Adidas and whatever else is brand of the day. Why? Because you had a group of people involved in that who saw themselves as more clearly being defined by what they wore than who they were. And the kind of statement that that makes about people's sense of themselves in that context, I think is really powerful. And it's on the back of that kind of loss of self-esteem that I think many people become incapable of making different choices from the choices that David Cameron thinks are laid out before them as a lifestyle menu. And you have to ask the question, a man that comes from 3 generations of stockbrokers and has never done anything but work in politics, what depth of understanding does he have in terms of what life is like on the estates that Shannon Matthews grew up on? And David Davis, another erstwhile Conservative minister, and you've got to love the honesty. You've got to love the honesty. I wouldn't try to do anything about correcting the inequalities. Let's get it right out there, straight away. I wouldn't even try to tackle inequality. Because the inequalities are widened by people getting richer, not by the poor getting poor. There's a man that's never come across a food bank. 6 things that are growing in this country, and one of them is the incidence of food banks. Right? And how many people thought that the day of the soup kitchen was virtually over apart from things like Centrepoint at Christmas? How many people thought that we were past a stage where people would be dependent on random charity in order to eat? We now have food banks in almost every major city in the United Kingdom. But that's not about the poor getting poorer. That's about the rich somehow getting richer. And the whole culture is based around this idea that David Davis sums up there. Frankly, as long as they generate wealth for the economy, as long as they generate tax income and so on, then I'm comfortable with it. So, let's just have a wee check. I'll come back to that in a minute. Yeah, let's have a wee check at this. Welfare fraud, the crisis in benefit spending, which is absolutely essential that we tackle, is estimated to cost the Treasury around £1 billion a year. And I'm not making any bones around the fact that there will be welfare cheats and there will be people drawing benefit who are creating that situation for themselves. I'm not denying that at all. But compare it with that. 70 billion lost through tax evasion. 70 billion. And you have to ask yourselves how many of those involved in that level of tax evasion are also sponsors of the current parties of government. And there are some real and genuine questions, I think, around that. But that's the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with. Now, again, let's not get ourselves wrong here. I am not denying that there are people who do take drugs. I'm not denying that there are people who are benefit scroungers. I mean, a really good example of this. I was at the Edinburgh Festival a couple of years back, and there were 4 of us. Myself, my wife, my 2 daughters, 2 of my daughters rather, and we'd fallen out. We'd gone to see a play called Blackbird, which is a really, really, really powerful play, and effectively it's about abuse, and we'd gone to see it, and we had a massive argument about it, right? So much so, we had such a heated argument about it, that by the time we got to the station, we weren't speaking to each other. It was a real good night out. And we got to the station, and we were getting the last train out of Waverley, going to such hotspots as Dalmeny, Inverkeithing, Kirkcaldy, Markinch, Dundee, right? So we're on the last train, and there's a woman sitting on the train, and it was packed, and we're in the foyer. She's sitting in her seat, and she's on her mobile, and she's doing that thing where she's engaging the entire carriage in the conversation that she's having with her friend. And it's brilliant. And she's doing this thing, and she's going, "You have me, have you?" She fucking has, you know. "You have me." "She has. She's eating my sandwich." "You haven't eaten my sandwich, have you?" "She's eating my sandwich." "I know, just an ordinary sandwich. It's a BLT and Ohing. Right, fancy." Right, so she's given it all of that, and she kept referring to her friend. Apologies if anybody's affected by the language, or rather offended by the language. Her friend was constantly referred to in the discussion as fucking Margaret. So much so that I actually thought that that was her name. And when eventually she came down the carriage and I was introduced to her, I was like, "Oh, hello, you must be fucking Margaret." I'm just David. I'm sorry, I don't have any additions to my name. But anyway, we were going through this whole thing, and she did this brilliant thing as well, where eventually she said to us, "What have you been doing?" And I said, "We've been at the Edinburgh Festival." She goes, "So have I." And I was so great. She said, "Yeah, we went to stand-up comedy." I says to Margaret, I says to fucking Margaret, I said, "I'm not going to see stand-up comedy because they'll just rip the piss out of you. That's how they do, like." So she said, "No, they will not, because it's like the Edinburgh Festival and it's right posh and all." And we went, and the boy that was standing outside, he said to us, "You can come in, girls. They'll not rip the piss out of you in here. It's right proper and everything." And we went in. I was only in 2 minutes, he's ripping the piss out of me. So you kind of get a general idea of the general drift and tone of the conversation. And she then said to us, "And where are you from?" And I said, "We're from Kirkcaldy." And she said, "Kirkcaldy? That's a minging place." I go to Kirkcaldy, I'm looking at folk going, "Did you dress in the dark? Belly like that, they leggings, that'll no do for me." And she went through, I said, "Where are you from?" She said, "Glenrothes." Now there was a surprise. But the point of the story is that one of my daughter's wonderful phrases, she said, I quite liked her really. She was a bee. And I said, "What do you mean she was a bee?" She said, "Well, she wasn't a wasp," which really clarified things for me. I'm sure you'll agree. And I said, "Sorry, I'm not getting this, Amy." She says, "The wasps are the ones that just sting you. The bees, actually, you need to annoy them." And there's that reality, isn't there, for young people out at night? There are wasps around. Good friends of mine, and they're in a band called We See Lights. They'd been out playing somewhere. They were standing at a cash line, and one of the guys in the band, lovely, lovely big guy, just a big dreepy guy, a bit like myself, before I started thickening out a bit. And he's standing at a cash line, some guy just walked up, punched him in the face. You know, I'm not arguing that it doesn't happen. I'm not arguing these instances don't exist. I'm not romanticising the situation that we find ourselves in. And you guys in here will know how challenging it can be to be out on the weekend. But what I am saying is that it's wrong to take all of that and translate it into a way of stereotyping and labelling whole classes of people. And it's wrong to use that kind of approach effectively as a means for justifying inequalities within our society. The reason why I'm using this quote, interestingly, is it's from a woman called Rachel Johnson. And the reason why that's an important piece of information for you is that her brother is Boris Johnson. So her brother is the Mayor of London, Conservative leader in London, and a potential leader of the party eventually. But Rachel Johnson's got a deeper understanding of the politics than her brother has, and there's what she says. She talks about the current trends that we're seeing, both in terms of the media and in terms of political policy, are inevitably going to entrench the middle classes and upper middle classes in their positions of power and influence. Because they have the money to support their children living at home, they've got the money to allow them to take on internships, to find their way into employment, they've got the ability to let their children go through university without incurring student debt. And what she says is what we're currently facing is a far more unequal society than we've experienced in the past. Now, regardless of what your political persuasion is, it's very, very difficult, I think, to argue with that. And so a pause for thought then around these statistics that I gave you. But here's some thoughts and issues for you. My argument would be that this unequal society that we're seeing is a society that's been created. And again, it was really interesting to listen to Christos when he was talking earlier, because he was saying exactly that. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a deliberate effort by the government to expand the middle class. That was quite clearly the effort that was being made, and I think it was almost as simple as this. Middle class property and share owners vote Conservative. If we wish to become more often the party of government as Conservatives, we need to create more Conservative voters. And so what did we see? We saw council house sales, and we saw the privatisation of major nationalised companies. And what happened as a result of that was that we suddenly saw a complete change in the housing situation in Britain. It's a change that we're still dealing with now. Because those that could afford it, and at the prices they were being offered, many people could afford it, bought their council houses. And I can remember very clearly, within 3-4 years of that, you could drive around some of the council estates in Kirkcaldy where I was working, and you could identify the bought houses. They all had a new door. They all had a B&Q door. They all had panels on them. They all had wee window bits on them. And they all had special knockers. And many of them had names. You know, you'd be driving around what was formerly Temple Hall, where houses had never previously been called anything but maybe 26. And you would suddenly find a property called Dunroman. You know, and that whole kind of culture around that. So what that meant was that it became much, much more difficult for local authorities to find housing for people in need. And the result of that was a concentration of the poor into particular geographic areas and the growth of the housing estate. Now, we'd had that growth of the housing estate post-war when we built in order to meet the challenges that we had around housing. But what happened at that period was a far greater funneling and concentration of disadvantage into specific areas. When I was working as Director of Children's Services for Stirling Council, I could name you the families that were in difficulty and facing challenges, and in some instances were creating difficulties and causing challenges. I could name them for you, and they all lived within streets of one another. And that was the reality that was created by that policy. It wasn't Karen Matthews who created the environment in which she lived. That environment was created for her. And the reality around that is that what we did was we gave people a vested interest around property and around shareholdings. People suddenly got a bit more, they had something to lose, and interestingly you saw that transfer in votes, often amongst working class communities, to the Tory party. And you saw Margaret Thatcher, a hated figure in Scotland, and a hated figure amongst many working class communities, becoming a heroine and a celebrity for many others. And that society was created, and it was created in contradiction to this commitment. I mean, this is a clear Marxist left-wing statement which says you should rise with your class and not beyond it. And actually, I think generally there's a strong tradition of that in Scotland, that people in Scotland will continue to identify with the class from which they came rather than the class which they might now be deemed to belong to. But I think it's just really interesting that what people were encouraged to do, and are still encouraged to do, is not to rise with their class, but to rise beyond it. Social mobility, as the current government speaks about it, and as the media now speaks about it, is the mobility of individuals from one class to another. It's not social mobility in terms of groups or communities or indeed classes. And I think there's something hugely important about that, because that's the concept behind it, that you get that separation, that those who have been successful should be seen to join rather than remain. And as a result, what happens is we lose social capital. And this, I think, is controversial, because I think there are some real issues around multiculturalism and identity for us. Multiculturalism, which is supported by the left politically, and is something which I support in many respects myself, but what it encourages people to do is to identify themselves on the basis of race or religion rather than class. Multiculturalism encourages people to identify with a smaller minority rather than a wider class grouping, which may actually have more power. And multiculturalism, while it undoubtedly has taken forward the interests of individuals, and I'm not arguing against it, but it's taken forward the interests of individuals and communities, I think at the expense of stressing that which unites them. I do a lot of work in Northern Ireland. I've been out in Northern Ireland a lot of times this year, and it's fascinating because the Troubles still exist, but they're no longer news here. And the reason they're not news here was summed up for me by one of the drivers that I had, and he said, "David, nobody's interested in reading about it now because we're only killing each other." That's the reality of sectarianism in Northern Ireland. And the communities that are still preying on each other, and the situation is undoubtedly improving, and I'm making no bones about that, but the communities which are still preying on each other have far more in common than they have dividing them. The communities that are preying on one another are enduring the same levels of poverty, the same levels of unemployment. They're enduring the same type of housing, the same type of communities, all of that. They have all of that to deal with and face with. But what they're being encouraged to do constantly is to identify themselves as Protestant or Catholic or Unionist and Republican. And what we're seeing as a result of that is communities which should be joining together to get the kind of social and economic change that would benefit everybody remaining divided. So there's something really powerful about how we encourage people to perceive their identity. And I think as well as that whole challenge, there's some key questions for us about the role of nationalism. We're being encouraged, above all else, to see ourselves as Scots. The whole referendum debate, I think, is encouraging this discussion about identity. And I have no difficulty with people who identify themselves on a nationalist basis as Scottish. I've got lots of things about being Scottish that I'm incredibly proud of. But if you were to ask me who I had most in common with, the Duke of Argyll, or somebody coming from a working class community in Northumberland, I don't think my first answer would be the Duke of Argyll. And the Scottishness that I share with him is not powerful enough to blind me to the things that make me different from him. And the divide of nationalism is not so strong that it blinds me to what I have in common with those people in the north of England and more widely. Now, I'm not arguing for or against independence. I'm not arguing for or against devolution. I am simply making a point that how we identify ourselves and who we identify with has a profound effect on how we think about who we are, and it has a profound effect about how we think about our politics. And again, it's interesting, isn't it? And we've seen it over the last few weeks. This whole discussion about the role of the trade unions in the labour movement, and that phrase about the trade union paymasters has come up time and time and time again. And the Labour Party currently is being criticised because of the sway held by the labour movement within it. Can I just simply, and I'm not advocating either the Labour Party nor any other party at the moment, but can I make the point that the Labour Party grew on the basis of a collaboration between the labour movement and left-wing political movements in Britain? And the entire principle in which the Labour Party was based was that the trade unions were the industrial wing of the party, and organisations like the Fabians and others were the political wing of the party, and they worked hand in hand. And it was perfectly clear and perfectly reasonable that these were groups that shared a common interest, came together, invested together, worked together, and attempted to make the same kind of changes. And now, seemingly, that's bizarre. And Labour can be blamed for enjoying trade union support. And I think we've got to seriously ask the question as to whether that makes sense. Because if you're David Cameron, or George Osborne, or Boris Johnson, or any one of a number of leading members of the Conservative Party, or indeed Nick Clegg, you have resources that you can call on that are beyond the dreams of a party that remains rooted in the working class. And the idea that somehow it's cheating to take money from trade unions seems to me to be questionable at least. But what's happened with it is that we've been given these ideas so consistently within our media and within our culture that lots of us have come to accept them without question. And I think we really need to ask whether that's the case or not. And two or three things I want to do before I finish. The first is to say, well, actually, does it matter? Does it matter that we have these levels of inequality? Is it not enough that we have the opportunity to escape from them? And the answer to that, I think, for me, lies in a book called The Spirit Level. And in The Spirit Level, what they've done, it's two academics from York University, and what they've done is they've looked at a whole range of evidence and statistics. And what they've determined is exactly what it says there, that societies that are characterised by high levels of inequality experience some of the problems associated with disadvantage disproportionately at all levels within that society. So if you look, for example, at an issue like mental health tends to correlate very strongly with poverty. So you would find that schizophrenia, for example, would occur more commonly in people who were in difficult, challenging economic circumstances than elsewhere. That's the statistical reality. In an unequal society, it occurs disproportionately, even amongst the middle and upper class. And the argument's made fairly strongly. I mean, I have to say that it's been dismissed by a couple of the leading Tory politicians as bullshit. That's the phrase that they've used to describe it. So I'm not telling you that, you know, the Spirit Level is the word of God, but what I am telling you is that it churns out significant amounts of evidence which suggests that levels of well-being are much lower in unequal societies than elsewhere. And I think you can see that if you look at societies like Scandinavia, which have been much more stable, have much bigger commitment to equality, and where people don't mind paying taxes if they can see that as bringing civic well-being, as opposed to the situation that we have here. So I think inequality does matter. I think it matters whether you're a victim of it or whether you're simply part of a society where it's a characteristic. And my second question is, can we do anything about it? And for me, there's a whole number of answers to that. Jamie, for me, sums up the picture of modern poverty pretty well. I was a teacher to trade. I started teaching in the 1970s, early in the 1970s. And I can remember dealing with young people at that time who were only affected by poverty. Household income was relatively low, but I would consistently get two parents turning up at parents' night, both ambitious, both asking questions, both keen to see their kids doing their best. Now, if I encounter young people in disadvantage, it's usually multiple disadvantage. And what's happened with the chav stereotype is that's become a reason for condemning them rather than a reason for supporting them. And one of my concerns, and one of the things I think we can do better, is that this is the situation that these young people often find themselves in. They often find themselves in the middle of that maze, and there's how people relate to them within that maze. That although Jamie and his family probably engage with a number of different agencies, communication between the agencies often is not strong, and even sometimes, and we know this from a number of recent tragic child protection cases, communication within agencies isn't very good. And what we need to do, and it's the government policy in Scotland, is this. We need to take young people out of that maze, and we need to start making a commitment to get it right for every child. And what that means is linking children to a lead professional. If you look at what happens to looked after children, and some of you may have come out of the looked after system, I don't know that, but if you look at what happens with looked after children, where they're successful, where they overcome the difficulties that they've had, is inevitably where they have formed a relationship with somebody who has taken an interest and demonstrated care towards them. And it comes up consistently. And that's what getting it right for every child is about, is getting that lead professional alongside who pulls in the other agencies so that we get concerted activity around the family. We need to get to a stage where people step beyond their professional boundaries and act as carers and recognise that in loco parentis they are there as carers and parental equivalents. And it actually doesn't matter, and I think the point's well made here, it doesn't matter who that lead professional is. It's the person that's got the relationship with the child and the family who has built trust and who can then use that trust to get the family to engage with those who might make a difference. And also sitting around this, we need to intervene early. And we need to intervene in ways that this government is moving away from. They're talking about children in England. There was a mention last week of children starting school at 2. This is from the same government that's cut back in the Sure Start programme. The ratio is that for every pound spent in early years, you're saving something like £15 later on in your spending children. It's more expensive to give children decent care than it is to keep them in prison. And yet, consistently, that's what we do. We have young people finishing up in prison, and quite often, as a director of children's services, one of the things that I was aware of was my highest levels of spend on individual young people, and they could be in 6 figures a year, were when they were probably around about 15 or 16 and in residential care. And very few of the children that we spent that amount of money on at that point in their careers actually had their lives turned around by it. And that's not a condemnation of the efforts of the colleagues who cared for them or the institutions in which they were looked after. It's simply a recognition that by that stage it's probably too late. And what we need to do is make sure that we invest early and think particularly about making the kind of traumatic interventions that can make a significant difference. I don't know whether there's been a Young Tories outing, has there? People are leaving, or is there something? I don't know. Hope I'm not upsetting people. And the other thing, I think, apart from the early intervention and the investment, I think one of the other things that we've got to do is we've got to recognise the personal contribution that people make. And I just love this quote. I don't know if you can read it from the back, but I just love this quote. Black American woman giving testimony to one of the national commissions. And there's what she says: I should have been a welfare statistic. Her background, her circumstances, everything about her should have condemned her to a life of poverty. but her teacher introduced her to the world of books. Her teacher gave her a passion. And what that meant was that she inhabited a different world. Not simply the world in which she'd been born and confined, but she lived in a world of the imagination. And by entering into that world of the imagination, she changed two things which are vitally important if we want to make a difference. We need to change people's sense, in many instances, first of all, of who they are and who they might become. And it's that sense of who people are and who they might become that ultimately makes the difference. And that's why this labelling is so damaging. Because one of the things that that labelling will tend to do is it gives people an excuse for not taking responsibility for their own lives. It gives them an excuse for saying, I'm just a chav. We need to give people dignity, we need to give them identity, and we need to give them aspiration. And my final point, before I throw it open for questions, is just some challenges for you, directly and personally, for you as individuals and for you as a group. Because here's some of the things that I think we need to look for if you're going to make a difference and if we're going to see a difference. And the first of them is this bit about big picture rather than single focus. What I encounter a lot of the time is young people particularly committed to single issue groups and campaigns and not willing to engage with that wider political agenda, and there are lots of reasons for that, many of them good. But if you go onto YouTube and have a look at a DVD called Paranoia, there's a brilliant example which talks about the reforms that the Labour government brought in the 1960s. And Roy Jenkins, who was the Home Secretary at that time, made homosexuality between consenting adults a legal activity. It had always been for women. He made it legal for men. And at a time when society was much more conservative, and when the Labour Party in particular was much more conservative, he managed to get that legislation through. Why? Because people saw it as part of a wider agenda about liberalising British society. And they recognised that if they wanted that overall liberalisation of society, then they had to accept that there might be elements within that programme which they didn't like. Compare that with our current experience around equal marriage, where it's become a single-issue campaign not associated with anything else, and it's bringing out all of the prejudices, background beliefs, and everything else around it. It's a single issue. It's not part of a package. There is no sense that if we as a civilized society recognize that there are many different ways in which people can love one another, then there should be many different circumstances in which people can become married. And I'm not arguing that committed religious people should be made to conduct these marriages. I'm not arguing that at all. We need to respect their position as well. But do you see the difference? That where we had something as part of a wider political agenda, it was possible to make radical reform. Now, Roy Jenkins' bill would be described in the tabloids as a paedophile's charter. And it would be hounded by tales of Facebook and internet grooming and all sorts of things. So big picture and not single focus. The other thing we need to do, I think, is get out of the humiliation game. And I'm sorry to say this to you, but one of the things, if you're serious, and maybe you're not, but if you're serious about doing something about the kind of inequalities that we're talking about, you need to stop buying heat to see how much cellulite celebrities have got in their thighs. Okay, we need to get out of the humiliation game. We need to get out of a culture where we buy magazines to see how well trashed Lindsay Lohan's been this week. We need to stop enjoying how screwed up Britney Spears has been, and all of that. We need to get out of a culture where it's profitable to demean human beings because they happen to be in the celebrity game. And if we want to see a brilliant example of that, look what we did to Jade Goody. If anybody can remember back to Jade Goody, you know, career made on the basis of Big Brother, instantly transferred into celebrity, a vulnerable young woman with a background so horrific that it's a miracle that she was able to cope as well as she did for as long as she did. And then suddenly she became fair game for the tabloids, and it was okay to describe her as a pig. Never heed Portugal, Italy and Greece, or Spain. It was all right to describe Jade Goody as a pig. How demeaning for those using those labels for a woman who had come from circumstances that they would have been unable to endure. But they didn't publish that stuff because we don't want to read it. And if we want to be genuine about how we're treated and how our society operates, we need to get out of that humiliation game as well. And we need to stop thinking tabloid. I mean, one of the things that's blooming shocking to me is that you get the Prime Minister of this country standing up in Parliament speaking as if he was reading from the Daily Mail. Right? So he doesn't dignify issues and make them subjects for debate. He personalises them. So instead of genuinely talking about some of the issues around benefits and the welfare state, he talks instead about Karen Matthews. Instead of talking about the kind of relationships that we need to drive modern industry forward in this country, he talks about Stevie Deans. He moves to the level of water cooler conversation in the office rather than dignified debate. And if we want to see an effective change, we've got to stop thinking tabloid too. We've got to stop oversimplifying issues. We've got to stop personalising problems. We've got to try and think a bit bigger. And I think we've got to bin the bling and ban the brands. Because we're all, well, we're not all, but many of us are still prone to it, aren't we? Many of us are in a situation where we're still into the whole bling thing. We're still into the brand thing. Nobody's going to turn up defiantly wearing their Woolworths sand shoes. Even if Woolworths were still open to the playground, you know what you get for it. You get bullied. You get all of that. But hey, lots of the time we just don't do it. How many of us are stereotypes ourselves? How many of us have made ourselves stereotypes? So that what we have is we have this kind of unrelenting conformity to a particular image. And there's something I think we need to think about that, because if we want a society that's based in individualism, we need to be prepared to be individuals ourselves. And we need to be prepared to say that we're not defined by what we have, and we're not defined by what we wear, and we're not defined by the brands. But we're defined by who we are and the contribution that we can make. There's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant wee clip on YouTube called What is Beauty? It's on the Neil Winton channel. And it's by a 13-year-old girl. And in her English class, she was given the opportunity to answer the question, what is beauty? And she produced this phenomenal PowerPoint, all about women's body image and its comparisons between Katie Price and Katie Piper and all of that. And at the end, when she begins to define what beauty is, she says some remarkable things. She says things like, it's the song that makes you laugh and cry all at the same time. It's the people who give something back. It's the people who endure things every day that we couldn't imagine going through. And it's just a completely different concept of beauty. But isn't it a powerful one? Rather than what you've bought or what you've worn or who you are, or what you look like. A definition of beauty that's largely based on who you are and what you do. And there's something enormously powerful about that. And if we want to get to it, then we need to make some sacrifices in terms of who we're prepared to be. And we need to get in the game. At the moment, we've got a situation where we've got powerful politicians, we've got powerful companies, and we've got powerful media. We are not going to make a difference there unless we get in the game. We're not going to make a difference unless we engage with the political process. And if you don't want to engage with the conventional political process, then engage with something like Anonymous, engage with some of the other groups that are around, get alongside Russell Brand, whatever you want to do, but get in the game. Because if we don't, I think, and you said this, Christos, I think there's a strong risk that we will move from recession to decline, and we will be in a situation which will be irreversible, where social capital will reside with a sufficiently large number of people that will be able to dismiss and disparage the poor. And that's a situation that won't last. That's a situation that's unsustainable. Is there a pattern here? I don't know if anybody saw it, But the minister responsible for the badger cull blamed the badgers for its failure. Badgers were apparently moving the goalposts. There are some right clever badgers roaming about this country, and they are defeating the cull. I mean, badgers, really. What are you thinking of? You should be queuing up to be shot, really, shouldn't you? And no, instead of that, you're trying to avoid the bullets. Well, what the hell is wrong with you? Don't you want to support government policy? Interesting, isn't it? The cull went ahead against the balance of advice from the scientific community. And the final point there, we have learned that those responsible for this so-called experiment are so incompetent that they couldn't even make a reliable estimate of the number of badgers. Did they take the blame? No. They blamed the badgers. And if we're going to move away from this culture, let me leave you, before I take a couple of questions if you've got them, let me leave you with some thoughts from a novel. And the novel is The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver. And in this particular scene, the main character, who at this point is a young boy growing up in Mexico, is walking with his mother past an Indian village which is in fete. Their white dresses swirled like froth, with skirts so wide they could take the hems in their fingertips and raise them up to make sudden wings like butterflies, fluttering as they turned. Indian girls, she spat. A corn-eater will never be more than she is. The dancers were butterflies. From 100 paces, Salome could see the dirt under their fingernails, but not their wings. And what I'm arguing we have is a culture that's pointing us consistently towards the dirt beneath people's fingernails and blinding us to their wings. Instead of defining people by the potential that they might have and who they might become, an encouragement that they be defined by the worst of what's around them. An encouragement for us to accept that change is impossible because those who need and would benefit most from the change are unwilling to have it made because they're content with the status quo. Take your choice. Do you want to be manicurists? Do you want to be flying instructors? And for me, the choice between dealing with deficits and enabling people to soar and see the world from a different point of view and a different perspective is a much more tempting one. If you're interested in some flight, I'm your man. Thanks for your attention.